5. Time. 15.
Thank you, everyone. I am beginning with a confession. Probably like a lot of you, I was tasked with a number of things which I realized last week I had failed to do. This included providing an academic reference to a former student. It included providing documents for a teaching abroad gig, and it also included providing a report for a committee I chair, and I was nudged into action on all of these things. And I am thinking about the writing of this book and what it's supposed to represent, and feel rather ashamed of the abject apologism into which I immediately descended, and I can actually feel myself doing it as I'm writing the emails. You know, the kind of thing, I'm so sorry, busy, 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 the task has been burnished on my heart and soul for weeks. I can't imagine anything more important, really, than the thing that you have asked me to do, and I promise you I'll do it. I've started to have this anxiety after hearing Reshma. It would explain a lot that I may actually be a woman. Anyway, the spirit I'm trying to convey in these excuses, I realize when I think them over, is that I want my correspondent to believe that I am a purposeful and productive individual with so many very important things to do. I want them to believe that I have the most robust work ethic they could imagine. I don't really know why I want them to think that. Well, I've written a book about why I think I know that I want them to think that, so I probably shouldn't say that. So you may think I'm about to give you life hacks on time management and email organization, which would suggest that you haven't read the book at all. I'm not really so interested in the failures. I'm more interested in the spirit of the excuses. Why do I want people to believe that I am a doer, that I am productive? Well, I actually wrote the book to put this spirit in question, to start wondering why it is we think about ourselves as creatures of action, why we see action and productivity and purpose as our source of pride, as our source of meaning. On the other hand, there's another dimension of ourselves which tends to other moods, lethargy, an unwillingness to do anything, or a wish to just sink into a kind of drifting, aimless inactivity. And for some reason, this induces a kind of shame in us. Now, this is difficult for me. I've had to put up with a lot of people in the course of publishing this book, making all kinds of snarky remarks about how I don't know anything about not working, and about also actually telling me that you know, the book itself licenses them not to read it, which I actually hadn't been sharp enough to alert myself to in advance. But what I try to tell them is that I have always been this way. I have always tended towards the other mood. That this goes back to a childhood in which, although I look at pictures of myself and see a sort of fine-boned imp, a nimble, skinny little boy. I think of myself as sort of dragging myself through the world with the gait of a sort of overweight old man. I think it had something to do with alertness or a lack thereof. This is something that I was always being lambasted and lamented for by the adults around me. I was always being told that I was slow, and my favorite one, that I had absolutely no sense of urgency. Certainly that I was always somewhere else, somewhere other than where I was supposed to be, because, of course, the most important thing was happening right in front of you. And when I think of my quite militant commitment as a child to being elsewhere and to, resisting the pull, the imperative of compulsory activity, I do feel rather shameful about how I've been pulled into the worldly habit of responding to everyone's demands. I kind of feel a tinge of disgust at those email excuses. I want to say to them, well, yes, I could have written the report for the library committee. On the other hand, you see, then I wouldn't have been able to stare out the window gormlessly, shoving ginger nuts in my mouth and making up rhyming schemes. For example, can you think now of 10 words that rhyme with Audi? Who are the 8 top goal scorers for Spurs this season? I feel like that would have been a real deprivation for me. And now there are various people in this room who I wouldn't want to know what I get up to during the day, who now do. So there's a failure of courage in not responding robustly, in not being honest about what keeps us from staying inside this mill, this hamster wheel of productivity. And I want to take that failure of courage seriously. That's, again, a reason for writing the book, because I think one of the things it does is it outlaws an entire repertory of moods. It excludes from our sense of who we are a kind of rich range of internal possibilities, boredom and indifference and lethargy. These are sometimes moods that take us into all kinds of creative and imaginative states. They take us to the outer edges of ourselves. They allow us to meet experiences that can be transcendent, that can be abject, but they certainly enrich and enlarge and expand our sense of who we are. And if we don't allow ourselves to enter into those inner states, if we feel ourselves tacitly coerced all of the time to respond to the immediate demands of now and to be completely consumed by shame and guilt at not responding to the demands that are imposing themselves on us at the moment, what we're doing actually is we're restricting our imaginative range. We are going to need AI, perhaps, more and more to integrate into our creativity, because our own creative possibilities are going to be reduced. So I would say that to define humanity purely in terms of purpose, in terms of what we do, rather than what we are, is imaginatively restrictive. It tunes out a certain range of inner experience. In a certain way, actually, it tunes out inner experience itself. Because what is it to have an inner life? It's not just to have something that's humming and whirring away, behind the front that we show the world. It's something that you sometimes need to tune into. One of the reasons, I suppose, for my interest in psychoanalysis is it just provided me with a place when I first got interested. It licensed me to have a place where I could tune into this other region of myself that I'd spent so much of my life being told was a bit useless and wasteful. So, to tune out of our boredom, to tune out of our wish to pause, to stop, to exit the wheel of activity, is really to switch off inner life itself. And we are very used from the beginning, really, of human civilization to the idea that there are certain active types in the world. There are all kinds of theories in story making about how the dominant characters of the great narratives are all active types of one kind or another. They might be tricksters, they might be criminals, they might be warriors, but they are defined in relation to doing. But there is a kind of subterranean history of narrative and of characters who are inactive, inertial. And I wanted to explore the idea that there are inertial as well as active types. I talk about the burnout. The burnout is a character who's had to surrender to the force of gravity, who's suddenly buckled under the burden of life. I talk about the slob. The slob is a character, I think, who's massively underrated. I talk about a character who came to my consulting room, a young man that I call Steve. He was a corporate investment banker who had sped through life, through the early parts of his life, with the kind of imperial ease. You could just imagine him as he talked about it, gliding across the glass, the corridors of glassy corporate palaces, working with opaque financial instruments, merging and acquiring companies. And yet, when I found him, he was, or rather when he came to me, he was dressed in discolored sportswear, moth-eaten and rather disgusting. His hair was matted, and he had this huge pot belly. He told me that not long ago, about 3 months ago, he looked like a jock with slicked back hair, and that he'd woken up one morning and his alarm had gone off ritually at 5 a.m., and he'd found that he realized he wasn't going to get up at all. He wasn't going to go to work. He was instead going to take himself off. After about 3 more hours in bed, he was going to take himself off to Starbucks and to Tesco's, where he would fill his shopping cart with boxes of Krispy Kremes, which he would then take back in bulk to his apartment and binge-watch box sets for the day, and then the next day, and the next week, and the next 3 weeks. And what he was doing, really, was surrendering to the force of gravity. We outsource this impulse to various pop culture heroes. Why are we so enamored of Snoopy, of The Big Lebowski, of Homer Simpson? They are the ways in which we outsource this impulse in us to refuse the dynamic, active self that we're always called upon to be. I also talk about the daydreamer, and I talk about the slacker, and these are people who in different ways take flight from the imperative of activity and into the outer reaches of the imagination. I am not suggesting that we become any one of these. I'm only suggesting that we recognize that each of them is a dimension of our own selves, that they are part of our humanity, and that if I could write those emails again, as I do every day, I know that I want to show the courage. And one of these days, I would like to lead a movement to do this if I could be bothered, will tell my interlocutor about the ginger nuts and the moronic rhyming schemes and advertising jingles that I need time to have whir around my head for a while. I'm not there yet, though.